16 years old when I went to war to fight for a land fit for heroes. God on my side and a gun in my hand, chasing my days down to zero. And I marched and I fought and I bled and I died. And I never did get any older. But I knew at the time that a year on the line was a long enough life for a soldier. We all volunteered and we all wrote our names. And we added 2 years to our ages. Eager to fight and ahead of the game, ready for history's pages. And we brawled and we fought and we whored till we stood 10,000 shoulder to shoulder. A thirst for the Hun, we were food for the gun. And that's what you do when you're soldiers. I heard my friend cry, and he sank to his knees, coughing blood as he screamed for his mother. And I fell by his side, and that's how we died, clinging like kids to each other. And I lay in the mud and the guts and the blood, and I wept as his body grew colder. And I called for my mother, and she never came. Though it wasn't my fault, and it wasn't to blame. The day not half over, and 10,000 slain. And now there's nobody to remember our names. And that's how it is for a soldier. 1916, Ian Fraser Lemmy Kilmeister of Motorhead. Welcome to the Doomed to Repeat It podcast, 002, World War I, with Brittany Butler and Frankie James.
I'm here.
Welcome again. Again, this podcast, we're going to mine some wisdom from the past. Without further ado, let's get started.
All right, sounds good.
Right on. So first, Brittany, welcome. We've known each other for quite some time.
Right.
Why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, Brittany Butler. I was in the Marine Corps from 2008 to 2012. I ended up being an intel specialist, did a lot of work out in Southeast Asia. Know a lot about the terrorist groups out there. But I've always had a fascination for history and kind of public speaking. So I'm really happy for this opportunity to be on this podcast with Chuck, of course. He's been a great mentor to me. But yeah, I'm just happy to be here. Happy to talk about some great history. And obviously in World War I, we had some great legacy put forth by our Marine Corps at Belleau. So I'm really happy to be here and talk about it.
Right on.
So,
We're
yeah.
going to hit the women's part too, because a lot of Americans don't even know a lot about World War I. Unbeknownst to many of us, there was a large women involvement in the war on all the services, right?
Absolutely, Chuck. Yeah, it was one of the first. It was the first war that women were able to be active duty, and it just kind of shows that women were always willing to serve in whatever capacity that they were able to. When we get to that, yeah, I've got some great stories, and some fantastic women who kind of were the pioneers in the military.
Awesome.
So continuing some of the education about some of the roles that women were able to fill. Obviously, we all know, like I said, the Rosie the Riveter, where they're kind of back in the homeland, taking up factory jobs and replacing the men with the manpower. But a lot of them did serve in nurse positions, and I just wanted to talk about 3 nurses in particular. At this time, we pretty much had, for the nurses, we had the Army and the Navy. They both had their own nurse corps. So the first notable woman is Lena Higby. She was actually, in 1908, she established the Navy Nurse Corps, and she was part of the Sacred 20, which were the first 20 women who signed up active duty with the Navy and would later deploy. She ended up being awarded the first woman to be awarded the Navy Cross, which I think is very impressive, and right in a badass. And then later on, in the time period of World War II, she ended up being the first female to have a warship named after her. So later on, here in the 2000s, another destroyer, because the last one had gotten out of commission, and so it was named after her again here in the 2000s.
Nice.
which just goes to show their legacy holds on as well too. Then we kind of have her counterpart in the Navy Nurse Corps. She was also part of the Sacred 20. Her name is Esther Hasten, and she ended up being a superintendent over the Navy Nurse Corps for numerous years. But there is a legend in 1917 that she ended up having her arm blown off. And the second that she couldn't sew it back on, she ended up just performing one-handed surgeries. So, that's the legend, and, I've seen it from a lot of sources, so hopefully I can get kind of back on some better sources, but that's the legend. And then the last one is part of the Army Nurse Corps as well, or instead. Her name was Julia C. Stimpson, and she was the superintendent of the entire American Army Nurse Corps in all of Europe. So that was impressive. She was also the first woman to be awarded the rank of major. And then she ended up receiving the Distinguished Service Medal and the Royal Red Cross Medal too.
Nice.
So there's 3 very notable women. Obviously there's a lot more with the Army Signal Corps and women were all over the place. But in the world scope, we got some really cool women as well. We have another woman, she was British. And she was working out in Serbia as a volunteer nurse, and she ended up getting separated from her colleagues. And in this war, Serbia actually allowed women to serve active duty in their army.
Yeah.
So she ended up serving with Serbia and going out to the trenches and part of the war fighting, and she ended up becoming the rank of sergeant major out in the Serbian army, and she got the highest honor in that military, which is, excuse my pronunciation, but it's the Order of the Karadushas Star. We gotta put some in there. And then all across the countries, women were a lot of the times were spies, because it's very easy for women to be spies.
Yep.
Just
Very
bat your eyes a little bit and a little flirtatious with some of the higher leaders, and that's a real easy way to be a spy. And then the last one I kind of want to mention was the Russians. Actually, they had Russian Battalion of Death. And it was like an all-female group of about 300. And they would be sent out to the trenches, and they were combat ready and combat trained. And they had whole battalions of women fighting on the Russian Western Front.
Yeah.
So until this podcast, I really didn't know much about this. And, once I'm learning more about this, just thought I had to share it. And pretty badass things going on, too.
That is cool.
Yep.
And so what do you think of America at this time? I mean, with, not the oppression of women at the turn of the century.
Right.
What type of women, what kind of support people were paying them, you said, to come over? They're paying their way to come to the fight.
Right.
I mean, what do you think as a woman back then, what would it take,
Well, I mean, it helped that a lot of these
Personality-wise.
women were doing the stereotypical nurse role. So as long as they were in their cookie cutter stereotype roles, people were very supportive of the women. But you better make damn sure that if you came home, you went right back into the kitchen and you were knitting your little dresses and having kids. But it was definitely an eye-opening experience, I think, for everybody in general, that we can give women these responsibilities, and they do have a sense of patriotism. And they're actually some of the big supporters and some of the big pushers for the suffrage movement as well, because that didn't occur until right after the World War One.
Right.
So they really are kind of one of the big reasons that got pushed as well too.
Nice.
Was the suffrage movement
I didn't know that.
women being allowed to vote.
That's cool.
Yep.
That's very cool. Yeah, I don't know why America was like that, or is still
Well, the
kind of
Western.
like that. Yeah.
Western culture really is.
So, but the Russians aren't, and I know about the Russian snipers, the female snipers in Russia, and the units. They would routinely use women in combat roles.
Right, that's cool.
Going back to women in combat, the Kurds have been fighting ISIS.
Yeah.
They have units full of young teenage women, badass snipers. They have nicknames, and they go into these units, and it's strange because they come from families that are very oppressive and very male dominated.
Right.
And if they didn't get this opportunity to do this, I mean, they would be in the kitchen. They would be hauling water, doing whatever. But they're out there helping eradicate ISIS from the planet.
And a lot of pilots too.
Yeah.
Right, not just the snipers. What I've been reading up on is there's this Lieutenant Colonel Germano, and she ended up being in charge of 4th Battalion out in boot camp, obviously, in Paris Island. And she ended up coming in there and just kind of like overhauling the entire process of boot camp. And this is, I want to say, 2012 roughly.
Right. And she was lambasted. She was wasn't she reprimanded or something for being too aggressive?
Right. So what happened is she had an expectation for the females there in boot camp, like, hey, there's no reason females should be qualifying lower on the rifle range or in academics or in drill.
Right.
You know, what would gender ever have to do with that?
Right.
And so she just started holding everybody in her unit more accountable, even down to the professional marksmen and then the comments they made, because they would love to tell women, oh, your arms are too short, or we just expect you to pass. Just pass, please.
Yeah.
And the men were never told things like that, you know, when they went through boot camp.
Right.
And it's separated. And we wouldn't even march from activity like the men do. You know, we didn't get the not only the arm strength from that, we rode in buses, and y'all marched everywhere and hiked everywhere.
I didn't know that.
And it's just little things like that kind of add up. And what happened is, this is right when the Marine Corps was saying, no, we don't want women in combat roles. So they had this whole narrative that women can't meet those expectations. So they're up in Washington telling people, women can't meet these expectations, we don't want them in combat yet. And Lieutenant Colonel Germano's like, hey, actually, if you hold them to this higher standard like I've been, we went from a 70% average of passing on the rifle range up to a 90, which is comparable to the male units.
Yeah.
And she just, you know, was blowing these figures out of the water. And I think a lot of that had the politics involved, where she came across as aggressive. Right. When any man who talked like that, it would have been heroic, and oh wow, he's a cool leader. Was it? But I think it had a lot to do with DC and the Marine Corps. This whole,
there's a lot of pushback
there was a lot of pushback with women joining into combat roles. Yeah, and so they were telling this narrative, like I said, and here she is, 4th Battalion, blowing the numbers out of the water.
I got news
so
for
it was a lot of politics.
I mean, everyone who's been in theaters, they've seen women in combat.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're a Marine or soldier in Ramadi or Fallujah, you see them all out with everyone else, doing everything everyone else does. And putting their necks on the line just like everyone else. There are women in combat.
Right.
On the ground.
Right, and doing badass things. Yeah.
The Marine Corps came up with the Lioness program.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was attached to them.
There you go. You get that.
So, yeah, so they would do all the searching. So, you know, women's would come in through a CMOC, which is like equivalent to like our BPS, and they would do all the scanning, all the searching, and, you know, we blow up, they blow up. You know, it's... I mean, it's one of those unfortunate, but it was awesome to have them there.
Yeah, no, part of the culture, extremely important for the fight.
Right, and for the future.
Yeah, and for the future as well.
They're just as driven, just as motivated. I mean, there's no difference. They're Marines.
Right, and we're even smaller numbers, so it's even harder to kind of get those really good mentors as well. I think that's kind of been the problem with the females, is we try to be too much one of the guys, and we're kind of leaving our sisters behind a little bit too. So, you know, women do a little bit. We've been, you know, we've got some issues with that too. You know, it's not just all the men's fault or whatever. But I think good things are happening. The word's getting out that, you know, women can meet these expectations. Let's give them a chance. Let's stop putting them down for anything. Let's stop saying they shouldn't be here. Right. And just give them a good, solid chance.
Yeah, I think I think that's just it. People who don't understand what's really going on in the military, they're reluctant to send their daughters, and young ladies are reluctant to join the military because they have that negative narrative.
Right.
You know.
And now, just today in our generation, is everybody's kids.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to send their kids off to the military, not like it was back in World War II.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, Brittany, World War II, absolutely. But your generation, they've stepped up. Post 9/11 generation warriors, men and women, 700,000 plus have stepped up since 9/11. 700,000 women, veterans we have, more than any in our history. So appreciate it, but let's get to World War I and the Marines at the Battle of Belleau. Hoorah. The first 3 years of the war, we weren't even involved. 1914 to 1917, it was the French. And then the British came in 16, and they lost millions in 16. So now for everybody, Europeans are, you know, they're tired, they're worn out. Every family has been touched. Millions of men, you know, sons, daughters, sons and and fathers have been killed already in the trenches, and some of the worst type of fighting that you can imagine. So on the American side here, we got General Pershing. He's commanding all of the American forces, the American, they call the AEF, the American Expeditionary Forces. And when he first got there, he came there with like, Americans, we can do anything. Yeah, we're very enthusiastic, and I'll talk about the recruiting effort here. But the Italians and the French and the British are just like, cool your jets, man. This is not what you think. You need to, kind of be not as enthusiastic. And Pershing, a little bit of history about him. He is used to raising young men to go fight Indians and fight in the Spanish-American War. And he got, he was training recruits in the Army on all these different campaigns that he went on from the late 1800s, the Spanish-American War, Cuba, the Philippines. He chased down Pancho Villa from Texas, just all these little skirmishes, and he knows the mettle of the pioneer American and the immigrants that came into the Army back in those days. He knew the spirit, and that's what it's the kind of army that he rose and he had there in Europe now. Right. So you'll see that this enthusiasm kind of turned the tide of the war and brought it to a conclusion at the end of 1918.
Right, it's understandable from the European side, like you delve into a little bit, but they were exhausted. They've lost a lot of good men. You lose morale after a certain amount of time.
Oh, the morale was non-existent.
So I think it was a great kind of refresh for the Americans to come in and give them a boost of confidence, for sure.
Absolutely. So this is one of
America, of course.
America. Yeah. So this is one of my sources, Peter Hart's The Last Battle, and the theme basically is, they kind of know when the armistice is. They know what's going to happen. Everyone knows that on the 11th day, at the 11th hour, November 11th, 1918, that's when they're going to, have peace. But, the soldiers in the trenches, they're very hesitant to die 2 days before they know they're going to go to peace. But we're still going at it. Pershing has been ordered to take certain things across the Meuse and the Meuse-Argonne, the forest and all that. We'll talk about that in the end. But no kidding. How would that be for morale if you know we're going to have peace in 2 days, and we're going to this big battle, and thousands of your buddies, and you're probably going to die.
Right.
Put yourself in that position. So that's kind of the conundrum. Pershing, and a quote from one of the book from Peter Hart in The Last Battle: the French, the British, and the Italians could have warned him of the danger of testing nationalistic myths on the battlefield, but Pershing was intransigent, and he certainly did not want to let his fellow Frenchmen and Englishmen down. We wanted to bring this war to an end. All right, so the recruiting effort went pretty well for the Marine Corps. We're going to concentrate on the Marine Corps mostly on this one because there's such a body of work. I've been studying this for like 2 years. I've got newspaper articles, a lot of different books, and it would do an injustice if I didn't, just concentrate on a little bit at a time.
Right. So
throughout the rest of the year, I'll be doing 3 or 4 more podcasts on World War I. I hit the British, hit the French. But this one, we're going to concentrate on the American forces and the 4th Brigade of the Marines that went to the Battle of Belleau. Ra? Yeah. So basically, when we went to war, the commandant said, hey, we need 30,000+ Marines to fight. So we rose our ranks, and the recruiting effort was actually quite easy. In 2 months, we had enough officers that were close to commissioning or close to graduating college to fill the ranks. So the Marine Corps said, okay, we're done commissioning officers. We're going to send in the Quantico, and the preponderance of the officers when we get to war, we'll grow them from the ranks. In other words, we'll give them battlefield commissions. Because for instance, in 6 Marines alone, my old regiment, I was in there for 1 year as an air officer. 60% of the enlistees at 6 Marines were college men. So fuck yeah, the warrior class emerges from the nation again, right? The youth, and it's innate feeling that every boy and young girl feels. You know, they feel like this call to adventure, right? They watch the current warriors do their bidding, and they're fueled by the stories. You know, back in those days, and even back to what's going on now. These kids joining the Marine Corps and the Army and the Navy and the Air Force now. They're watching YouTube videos. They know these stories. They want that hero's journey. You know, all the greenhorns, you know, that no one saw combat before, except for some of the leadership.
Of course.
Like the captains and above, they had all been in combat before. A lot of the staff NCOs had been in combat because we were at war with Spain. Mm-hmm. So they saw combat in Cuba, the Philippines, Veracruz, in the Indian Wars, the late 1800s. There were a lot of leaders left over from that. So we're used to fight. The leadership is used to fighting, but all these young Americans, these teenagers and 20-somethings, they haven't done it before. So when they got there, they're very eager to learn. So quote, we received our Lewis guns the same night. First Sergeant Jesse Kavanaugh, Sergeants Scott and Nagel, and several others sat up all night in the orderly room with sergeant instructor from the British and mastered the handling of that weapon. This was simply typical of the spirit that every man in the company showed at every opportunity to fit himself in for the actual work down front. We marched to a nearby town and received British steel helmets, gas masks. We turned in our American rifles and received British in return. General Pershing, when he had observed the Marines on the range and shooting, he recognized it immediately because he knew that his soldiers couldn't shoot that well. Why? Because Pershing was a competitive marksman when he was a young captain. So he went up the ranks, and at one time he became the Army's second top shooter in the pistol and rifle. So he recognized that the Marine Corps was very serious about marksmanship, and that's why, probably one of the reasons, after seeing them being trained, that he was able to put them out front. Because initially, Pershing was asked by the French okay, we've got all these Americans, we're just going to backfill and use you guys for combat replacements. Mm-hmm. We're going to put you with the French units and British units. And Pershing's like, no, absolutely not. We're going to fight as our own force.
America.
And he wanted to do that. So that's what happened.
Do you have any answers as to why, even back then, why there was such a distinction between the Army and the Marine Corps when it came to marksmanship?
Well, the Marine Corps is extremely small, and it's easier to get quality training with the smaller organization.
Of course.
The Army's is so massive, and it's really, really hard to train at high level to the masses. Now, they got some units they could take out, and they could train at a high level, but to get that many soldiers, I mean, these soldiers and Marines they've been in the service months.
Right.
So.
And even back then, kind of, I'm guessing the Army had more high-tech equipment for World War I, so they were able to rely more on stuff like that as well?
I don't think that. Actually, both the services didn't have a lot of equipment at all. The French
tanks or anything?
We had some, but the preponderance, 80% of the tanks, the airplanes, and the artillery pieces came from the French, and all the other equipment. So we supplied fresh bodies, enthusiastic warriors, right, with the fighting mindset, and that were fit, and that weren't drugged down from years in the trenches yet. But the Europeans supplied most of our equipment.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, I was surprised about that too. Mm-hmm. So that's a little bit on the training, and and you've heard it. I mean, many accounts of the old salts who forgot they were once boots and greenhorns. So once they get there, a lot of the French and British instructors, they're treating Americans like a bunch of boots and greenhorns and whatnot. But that's rite of passage.
Exactly.
Everywhere you go, no matter how long you're in the Marine Corps, when you show up to a new unit, you're the boot.
That's right.
Right?
Yep.
You could have been for 8 years, and you're like the boot sergeant. Yeah.
And there were no laws against hazing back then.
Yeah.
So who knows what they went through?
Oh yeah, for sure. But the young American, the Americans looked up to these French instructors and these British instructors because they took the brunt of the hazing or whatever it was going on back then, because these guys had survived years in the trenches, and they knew about fighting second generation, hand to hand, warfare. So yeah, so they paid attention, and it was well noted on all sides how enthusiastic the Americans were when they were going through the training. The Europeans had been at war since 1914 and had staggering losses on all sides. By the end of 17, so when we were starting to come over, the Americans starting to come over, France had lost 1,280,000 dead. These aren't casualties, these are deaths. Russia had lost over 2 million dead against the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians in the east. Great Britain, the British Expeditionary Force, had lost 500,000 dead. And then 1.4 million wounded and 176,000 missing in action or POWs. Okay, so a little bit about Russia too, because it's really important. Russia was on the edge of a revolution and the end of the Tsar state. Europe was drained emotionally, economically, and morally with their militaries. They were at their bitter end. All the nations were. The French had the longest journey, though. Britain entered the war in 1916 and gave some relief. The British Expeditionary Force mobilized 2 million British soldiers on the Western Front that year, and some days they lost tens of thousands at a time. And that poem I read, 1916, from Lemmy Kilmister from Motorhead, echoes, you know, their tragedy in 1916. So our tragedy was in 1918 at the end of the war. They had the same thing in 1916, but they're still at it. I mean, they're still at it. They got mobilized in 16, and they're still fighting in 17 and 18. I'm not going to talk a lot about the war at sea, but the war at sea actually brought us into the war.
Right.
With the U-boat sinking the 3 merchant ships.
Submarines.
With American citizens on them.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah.
American citizens and sailors on them.
And I can see why President Woodrow Wilson would not want to get involved. It's a whole ocean away. We're giving up a lot of resources already to support what's going on. No one's on our land, obviously.
Right.
But I'm glad that eventually we can come together as countries and start supporting each other. And it also, killing our own citizens certainly pushes you to get involved.
Yeah.
But I do want to kind of mention about that. You know, we talked about when we got involved with the war, but kind of going on to some of the things that women were able to do. Even before America got on board in the war, a lot of women were serving in the American Red Cross and the YMCA, and a lot of them were simply volunteers who had to find people to sponsor them and make their own money to get over to Europe.
Wow.
And they were incredibly patriotic, and it is other countries, but they were moved, and they were inspired to go help the wounded and help any way they could. They were the ones falling around helping fix uniforms and being nurses and doing admin kind of stuff. So even before anybody called upon them, they were volunteering already.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I thought it was pretty interesting that you think about women in 1916, 15, like, how are they convincing people to give them money to leave the country to go to war?
Right.
I just feel like that would take a lot of tact on their part and
Right.
a lot of respect for the people who would let them go.
Mhm.
Because we all know this, the stereotype of women in the early 1900s. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
I mean, it goes to the American spirit, though.
that too.
Because we're a young, pubescent nation, and the people that came to America, I mean, it was to be an immigrant and come from Europe or come from some part of the world, everything that you know, and start a brand new life. That takes some some serious courage.
Right.
So that being bred, on the prairies and whatnot, all these wars during this period of time, even though I went over the Spanish or the Mexican-American War,
Mhm.
it was the same thing. They wanted to get after it. They wanted to be a part of this new nation. This same kind of fervor
Right.
permeates to the women. How many women do you think served? It was a lot more than
In World War One, it was the first war they were able to serve active duty and actually got veteran status. But overall, about 25,000 women were able to serve, and that does not include the Red Cross or the YMCA.
Wow,
Yeah.
25,000 came over to Europe.
Mm-hmm. No, we're active duty.
Oh, okay, got it.
Right. So the nurses and like the Army Signal Corps were
Yep.
really the ones that deployed overseas, but the rest. So I would say about 22K were the nurses, and then about 500 in the Army Signal Corps, where they were
Nice.
bilingual and helped with the telecommunications,
Right.
the old switchboard kind of stuff.
Nice.
I kind of want to mention too. We think about nurses as kind of a wimpy kind of term in the medical field. But you have one discussion with an Army medic or a corpsman who's been involved in a war.
Mm-hmm.
Those operating in the hospitals, that's a grotesque, and that is just a lot of pressure in there, and it's some nasty stuff going on, and men wailing in pain. So when he just always put that in perspective when we're talking about nurses and war, because it's definitely not a pretty sight, and for the stereotype of women, especially back then, I mean, I think that's just goes to show their tenacity and their dedication.
The PTS wound absolutely occurs in the aid stations and in the medical side of the house. I mean, you can see it on their faces. And it takes a toll. They're the ones that are repairing or trying to save lives, and I mean that certainly is extremely stressful.
Right.
I mean, I couldn't do it.
I don't think I could either.
No.
And the disease, we haven't even talked about that too, but disease was rampant back then, just because there's not a lot of sanitary technology like we have today.
Well, actually,
it got better, but
more American soldiers died from sickness and disease than the bullet.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, I'll go over at the end of it. I'll go over the numbers on the American side. So the French industry actually supplied the vast preponderance of the machinery and equipment, as did the Brits when we came aboard for the war. The Americans brought their bloodlust and tribal yearning to fight evil, as did the British before us. So the French industry supplied 3,500 of the over 4,000 pieces of artillery to the Americans. 227 of the 289 tanks that we used to the Americans, and the aircraft piece, the aviation piece. There was a big air war too. I'm not going to go into that on this podcast, but we certainly are going to hit aviation history as well. 4,800 airplanes of our 6,300 were given to us by the French. So America stepped into the breach, World War I. All sides were expecting, and plans were made for the war to continue through 1919. We expected to be there for a very long time. This would have been crucial because Americans now had experience in combat arms and maneuvering armies. So Major Catlin, at age 49, commanded 6 Marines. When he was a first lieutenant in 1898, he commanded the Marine detachment on the USS Maine, which survived the sinking in Havana Harbor, which brought us to war with Spain. If you all remember that. Remember the Maine? He was on that. In 1914, he had a provisional regiment in Veracruz where he earned a Medal of Honor. Severely wounded at Belleau Wood, he retired in 1919 as a brigadier general. He's one of the famous figures. When war was declared, the Marine Corps consisted only of 419 officers and 13,000 enlisted men. That's the size of the Marine Corps at the time. Congress voted to expand the strength to 31,000, which was the largest corps in our history at that time. And the campaign for First to Fight, that was our slogan for recruiting. The nation's youth answered the call. By June 1917, the Corps shut down the commissionings for second lieutenants, and in 2 short months, they had enough new leadership, and decided they would grow their future officers from the ranks as they waged war. So new recruits went to Parris Island for boot camp, and officers went to Quantico. Our commandant at the time was General Barnett. He was a prominent insider with the president. He ordered the 5th and 6th regiments to be raised. When they had troops trained and ready to go, okay, here's something pretty cool. That's why I put this in here. Politics, right? So our commandant was pretty smart, and he foresaw a lot of good stuff. The Army ran interference. They wanted to be there first, so they wanted to load up all the soldiers on the ships before the Marine Corps. But the Marine Corps was like, hey, we want to be the first wave of ships, and we were able to because even though the Army had filled all the ranks on the ships, the commandant did his homework. He asked the president, because he knew President Wilson, and President Wilson approved it. So, okay, yeah, we're going to get this brigade of Marines, the preponderance of the Marines, at least 2,000 of them on this first wave of ships. But the Army said, hey, they're already filled. We already filled them. But unbeknownst to them, the Navy's chief of staff Admiral Benson was good friends with the Commandant. And the Commandant already talked to him. He's like, yeah, I'm going to set aside these 3 ships for you and the Marines, so you're good. He did this before he even asked the President, because the Army tried to give us the stiff arm. And we were able to get on there on the first wave.
Right.
But that's one of the lessons, man, we talked about in the first podcast. I mean, as a leader, if you're a CEO in your industry or you're leading an organization, you've got competitors.
Right.
You've got to run interference with your competitors to get the edge so you can take care of your company. It's like that at every level. Yeah. Even a small unit, if you're a captain among 4 companies in a battalion, to take care of your company, you have to know where the other company commanders are at, and you got to get in front of them, especially if there's 5 pieces of chicken on the table and there are 10 brothers.
Yeah.
You want to feed your Marines, right? So, just a little food for thought there. Quote, John Thomason wrote poetically, "There were also a number of diverse people who ran curiously to type, with drilled soldiers and a bone-deep sunburn and a tolerant scorn for nearly everything on earth. Their speech was flavored with Navy words and words culled from all folk who live on the seas and in the ports where warships go. They drank wine and reminisced on sake and vino and Bacardi rum, strange drinks in strange cantinas at the far ends of the earth, and they spoke fondly of Milwaukee beer. Rifles were high and holy things to these men, and they knew 5-inch broadside guns. They talked patronizingly of the war and were concerned about rations. They were leathernecks, the old-timers, collected from ship's guards and shore stations all over the earth to form the 4th Brigade." So these are the leaders that they brought that had been fighting. And what do those guys sound like?
Old timers.
Old timers, like
Yeah.
the gunny
Yeah.
that you were afraid of when you first showed up to your unit, right?
Yeah, or a salty captain.
Or a salty captain. There's a bunch of salty captains too, man.
And think about the generation difference. These guys were being raised in the 1800s, and now we're at the turn of the century, 15 years later. I can just imagine just the generational gap
Yeah.
that we even see today.
Yeah, I mean, they're a bunch of badasses, leaders that came. So, like a lot of our wars, even in World War II, we had a lot of leaders like Chesty Puller who had seen combat. So, the preponderance of our leadership in the Marine Corps here, even though they hadn't fought on a large scale like this, they still fought, and they knew what combat was about.
And made certain sacrifices to
Absolutely.
earn respect. Yeah.
So, off to sea for the first wave. They're on the ships now, thanks to our commandant. On the first wave, June 26th, 100 miles out at 10:20, the ship was attacked by a German U-boat. This is June 23rd, 1917. 100 miles out at 10:20 at night, the ship was attacked by a German U-boat. And so that's well documented. The three torpedoes missed, and war's on. They got to France, and the very first thing that they did, they thought they were going to be in the trenches. Wasn't so much. They got off the boat, and they began having working parties and whatnot.
Of course.
Training. They make it there to France, and the first thing they do, Pershing receives them, and they split them up. They split a battalion out, half a battalion to Great Britain, port duty, working duty, and just like the Lance Corporal Network, it's just like, first to fight? What do you mean first to fight? This is first to work.
First and sweet. Yeah.
So they did a little bit of that moving around when they first got there until more American Army came over to relieve them, and then the training started. So they got there in the spring of 17, a full year before the Battle of Belleau Wood, and they trained, before they got into the trenches, they trained all that summer with the French, and that's what they were looking up to the French combat-hardened warriors of this first war, and they just sucked everything in, and they kept their marksmanship training sharp. And again, Pershing understood how good the Marines shot, and actually it turned the tide in the Battle of Belleau Wood, and we'll talk about that there. So all summer long they trained, and then towards the end of 1917, they went still under training to the trenches, and they went there for almost 2 months, 57 days, and I'm going to read some passages.
Do you know why they waited to start training out in Europe? Because I feel like it would kind of suck to have all these new fresh bodies, and
Yep.
now they're stuck for 6 months training when, the people have been in war for years are
Yeah.
still stuck in the trenches. Is it more because it was a joint operational kind of training?
I think
and
that they
needed-
wanted to feel us out, number one,
Okay,
but number
yeah.
two, we had not, and we had the reputation of never, having this large of an army since the Civil War. So we needed to understand what the trench warfare was like,
Right.
and we needed to understand how the French and the British used their tactics if we were to support them.
Right. Especially
And-
with the artillery, I guess, and the different.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole thing, and then the trench warfare itself is something that we've never had to do. So, we got the fight as one unit, and the fourth. Okay, so we got this 4th Marine Brigade, and under it we've got the 5th and 6th Marines, 2 regiments under them, and now we're going to the trenches. So. Once in the trenches in a quiet area, the regiments would rotate 1 battalion forward and 2 battalions in reserve. So when our Marine regiments got there, even though they were there for almost 2 months, they still rotated from the front line trenches to the rear trenches, and they were a little bit different. Okay, so they all got together on line, and a leather-lunged old-timers all yelled in unison, "Forward march!" And the highly fit, disciplined, and trained Marines impressed the locals, the French, General Pershing and his staff alike.
And the Germans, too.
Yeah, and the Germans as well. On St. Patrick's Day of 1918, the Marines relieved the French battalions on the line on 17 March 1918. Fighting ensued immediately, so they're in the fight now. Here it is, St. Patrick's Day of 1918, and we're in the fight. Raids, skirmishes, fresh Marines wanted more blood, but their French counterparts held them back. Battle-weary French would rather have waited the Germans out. So, routine raids, night patrols, artillery barrages, constant working parties, lice and rats. They're in it, and this is what we asked for. Here it is, training for all summer, and then December of 17, and now it's the spring of 1918, and we're on the lines in our first combat action. And again, we want to take more prisoners, do more raids, but the French, at this time in the war, they'd rather just sit back and wait it out, trade artillery barrages with the Germans, but we want to continue to go over the top. But again,
the Marines had something to prove as well. They were still fighting for their legacy. They were still fighting to be deemed the first to find that they were more high caliber than the Army was. So, I could see why that went down.
yeah,
It did. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's kind of like our DNA throughout history.
Yep.
And again, the leaders have all been combat hardened. They were pushing their young, their young greenhorns, if you will, to the fight. So, 53 days on the line. That's what they did. Only 53 days. And then still considered this combat their training. Their training was complete. In early May 1918, the 4th Marine Brigade was relieved and joined the 2nd Division for final training. And they say training, but this is more, it's constant training. Even, our modern warfare, you have units that come into theater, they still go through a battery of exercises before they go out and start patrolling. Okay. 2nd Division for final trainings. During this time, they were, so the 53 days, the Marine Corps lost 128 Marines killed and 744 wounded. And some of them were in training exercises, but this is the real deal. We're there.
This is kind of like OJT, right? Kind of what we would describe it as on-the-job training.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because again,
People are dying. It's not like,
Yeah,
a welder,
Yeah, absolutely. And it's combat, and they had just joined a little over a year ago.
Yeah.
Most of them, or a year before. Most of them had joined just a year before. General Person gave the command of the Marine Brigade to Brigadier General James Harbord. We're not going to go into him too much, but he was a pretty good figure. The Marines got along with him pretty well. And, Pershing, he was never known to praise Marines, but he told his new general, "Young man, I'm giving you the best brigade in France. If anything goes wrong, I'll know who to blame." So again, him being a warrior's warrior and being that marksman, he saw the Marines under training. He knew the caliber
Right.
that they were getting in theater.
You're getting here.
Yeah. And actually, a couple of generals on the French and British side, they referred to the Marines as shock troops. We were their shock troops, like the Germans had their stormtroopers.
Right.
They consider us as shock troops, and we learned that after the Battle of Belleau Wood. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
For other countries to see us as that is really cool.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
Show me, show me, show me. All right. So now that they're done with that, their final training, they get a little R&R right outside of Paris to chill out. But then there's rumors in the high command that the British are about to make this huge offensive, and this is where it all starts. And they're just outside of Paris on R&R when the Germans conduct at 0300 on May 27th. They conduct an offensive and smash through the French and British lines. The salient, so this maneuver element, unnerved the British and the French high commands. They advanced in force down to the Marne River, which is just 25 miles from Paris. They got that close. They got within marching distance of Paris, and they'd be in the streets in Paris in 24 hours. So how the heck did high command, how did they let this happen? Right? So now, Libo's over, get everyone together. The French had a doubt about asking Pershing to cut them off. The Pershing gave orders to move out and move out to the sounds of guns. So the French goes to the American army. Hey, can you stave off the attack? You're kind of closer and you're just all rested. So on June the 1st, they traveled in trucks a couple of 15 miles from Paris. The French trucks, they made it close to the front on the Paris-Metz road, which is just 9 miles north and west of Chateau Thierry, which is right outside of Belleau Wood. So Belleau Wood, when I went there back in 2012, I mean, I didn't know how close it was to Paris. I mean, it's like a 30-minute drive to the wood.
Right.
And that's where they were. So the Germans had pushed through, kicked them out of their trenches, and in force with some of their best shock troops, some of their most, best leaders, and now they're here.
Some countries will surprise you, though. There are some states where we don't know where the capitals are, but
Right. Like North Dakota, you know what the capital is?
No.
Bismarck.
Oh, cool. All right, what's the capital for?
We'll cut that out.
Maybe we'll cut it out. All right, so here's the cool part. So now it begins, right? Again, the French had their doubts, but they asked Pershing, hey, we need you to cut them off. And Pershing goes to the 4th Brigade, hey, go to the sound of the guns. So they get on the trucks in quick order, and they get down to right outside the wood. Right, there's a road that goes right past it. And as they got down there, the staff officer from the French was trying to convince Major Fritz Wise, one of the battalion commanders, to go back, to fall back and retreat. And they would not only hear the German artillery, but now they could hear German machine gun fire while they're having this discussion. Right. Now the Marines we just got from Paris, we're unloading on the trucks right outside of Belleau Wood, and the French are actually running away. Right? And,
Comes the Germans.
Retreat, hell, we just got here.
It's coming.
Yeah.
That's coming. They could not, like I said, they could not only hear the German artillery, they heard the German machine guns. Major Wise to the French officer, quote, "I have come here to fight the Germans, and this is where I intend to do it. And that is that, by God." That's the way they talked back in the day.
So poetic.
2-5,
Yeah, right.
2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, storied battalion. All these battalions are storied battalions. Was commanded by Colonel Nivelle. He ordered 2-5 Marines a half click away, 500 meters away, and you've got to get there right away. And when you get there, you stick. tie in with the 23rd Infantry on your left and 6 Marines on your right. So he basically is telling this battalion commander of 2-5, they're the first ones down there, to get out there. And then, so they quick marched. They went, he got his 1,000 Marine battalion out there in time. But when he got out there, he was all alone. There was no one on his left, and there was no one on the right. 2-5 was all alone. The French, the grunts, were in full retreat, and they could hear the German machine gun fire as they were retreating. A French officer buttonholed Captain Lloyd Josh Williams, and this is where it comes from, get ready, of 2-5, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. He ordered him to retreat. And his famous reply, retreat hell.
No, we just got here.
Retreat hell, we just got here. Then 2-5 sent the cryptic message. After that little encounter, to make sure that everything's on the up and up, and to understand, have that battalion commander convey what was happening to higher headquarters, he actually sent off a message, and the message was, the French Major Kerbin delivered written orders to fall back. I have countermanded the order, and kindly see that the French do not shorten their artillery range. Captain Lloyd William, USMC.
Some sound advice right there.
Right. So from the time that Pershing got the orders from the French, and the time Pershing told the 4th Brigade, and then went down to 6 Marines, or actually to 5th Marines, in 45 minutes, the battalion quick time in full gear to make it to 500 meters. I mean, 500 meters is not that far, but you've got a whole battalion of 1,000, right? So once they're at the 500 meter mark, they've got to put the battalion on line, and that's exactly what they did. So the line, think about it, you've got 1,000 men, no defense in depth, the whole battalion on line. It's 2.5 miles long. So that's what took them 45 minutes to get there and to get ready for the Germans, which were coming. And again, they can hear the machine gun fire. The battalion was on line 400 meters wide. The German rounds started landing. Now, game on. This is it. The first, rounds Belleau Wood. A couple of Marines were killed in the first salvo. Lem Shepard led a company. He was a company commander, a future commandant, of 200 men to the wood line and ordered a halt. They broke cover, and another barrage ensued on top of them. Actually, German recce plane. This is the only reference of aviation dropping any ordnance, which I'm kind of disappointed. I thought the Germans were doing some close air support, but they dropped a bomb and wounded a lieutenant. So, and he got wounded in the ass. So,
like Forrest Gump.
put the ass in cast. That's good. My teacher say that.
And for that time period to have one story of aviation, and they only took out a lieutenant.
Well,
kind of like it seems like a waste,
Yeah, right. But they used aviation assets. The Germans used aviation assets to and blimps to guide their artillery. Their artillery was very, very accurate because they had the eyes in the sky.
So they weren't usually dropping bombs or using them as kind of like targets.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. As the Marines dug for their lives, they dug in with their hands, their bayonets, and those who had shovels. The Germans advanced thinking they were invincible because they had just pursued the French, and the French were running.
Running away.
So you can think, these guys are like, oh yeah, we got them. This is it. Game over. But this is where Marine Corps marksmanships come in. We didn't give our weapons up to the Brits, and we didn't take the Enfield rifles like the Army. We'd been training with the Springfield 1903 rifle. And our marksmanship program was at such a high level because of all the warring we had been doing. The Marine Corps marksmanship program that you all went through, that I went through, was born from these days. So the Marine Corps started, and they started picking off the Germans at a long range, at 600 meters, which is unheard of back in those days. So the Marine Corps marksmanship program not only surprised and stunned the Germans, as it did Pershing and his Army regulars and the French. It confused the Germans and halted the German advance because they were dropping like flies at 500 and 600 meters.
I'm up, they see me, I'm down.
Yeah.
In their case, I'm dead.
So
if they see me, I'm dead.
It's always been that's one of the reasons why it's always been a hallmark for us in the Marine Corps, and it still exists today. Quote, experimentally, he raised his rifle to cover one of those forms. They were so like the silhouette targets on the rifle at range, say, the 600-yard line. When glimpsed through the small aperture of a peep sight, iron sights, they were nearly identical to the outline of the chest-high figure men, their head and shoulders rising above the flood of waving grain through which they came. Train, train, train. Fall back on your training when your heart rate gets up there. So this quote from one of the young Marines, his marksmanship training paid off. Hey, these Germans look like the silhouettes that we are using. Yeah, good. And they just started dropping like flies. And again, they stopped their advance right there, right outside the woods.
Nice.
So, target, the half-drawn breath. Here's another quote. Target, the half-drawn breath, a finger pressure, recoil. The German staggered and seemed to sag, suddenly, wearily, so close that one could see his dumb surprise on his face. A hand swung out instinctively to ease his fall, and then the figure settled, limp, at rest, pillowed in broken grain. The Germans made 2 waves and were thwarted by marksmanship. They went into this thing thinking this would be a cakewalk to Paris, and they were woefully wrong. Caitlin noticed that the marksmanship of the French was non-existent. You have to adjust your sights and know the range and fire effectively. It was just after almost 4 years of war and beyond their experience. That's another quote from Lieutenant Caitlin, who also became a commandant. We're going to follow him through this battle and through the rest of the war, because he's a pinnacle figure in the Marine Corps, number 1, but number 2, we can't follow all the battalions. So this is the one company, the one battalion that saw the most action and then all the action. So here's the discussion piece: training versus experience. Here we have the French, who had been battle hardened for 4 years, and they weren't even changing they didn't even estimate ranges when they were trying to shoot. Marksmanship was non-existent. They would just barrage fire out. So
we're innovators when it came to that perspective aspect.
Yeah, that's a common theme through American. A good friend of mine who works for a Chinese company, he's Indian by birth, he's worked for KBR as an engineer for a long, long time, and he says that the world knows that America are innovators. I'm not trying to beat our chest or anything like that, but I knew we were pretty good at most things, but that's just in our DNA for some reason.
It is.
This happened in World War II as well, right? We had the worst equipment, and we were fighting this extremely competent, experienced German army. And we were able, our tanks were built by Dodge. No offense to Dodge, but the German series tanks were built by Porsche. So their aircraft, their equipment were all superior, and we were still able to defeat them.
There you go.
Same back here. So our marksmanship was superior, and we were fresh, and a lot of our Marines had never seen combat, but we were able to stop this attack because of their training. So you get the training and the experience. You were in those units where you got these guys who are they've been to all these schools and they've been to combat and have all this experience, but there's just something missing with them. They don't have that
that want to drive.
That want to drive. But you get this new fire eater that pays attention, has no experience, brand new to the unit or new to a company, and they're paying attention, and they're able to exceed expectations and exceed those old timers, if you will. So just think about it. The French were as enthusiastic as the Americans were in 1914. After a year of that kind of fighting and all that devastation, all the old timers or the new guys come in. All the old timers said, "No, let's just wait them out.
Yeah, keep doing what we've always done."
They'll always do it. And then new people come in. 1916, the British, they're enthusiastic, ready to go. After a year of fighting, they're back to, oh man, this is way too, challenging.
Right.
Yeah, we're gonna move back, and that's so. Americans are here in 1917, 1918. Same thing. We probably have a shelf life of a year or two. If it went into 1919, the war, we'd have probably been in the same boat.
Oh, you think so?
I think so.
Yeah.
Just think about.
We could never
the
know,
misery.
but that makes a lot of sense, though. Yeah.
So, but just think about all the French, where they get the new kids in, the old timers are telling them, you don't need to do marksmanship.
Right.
We don't need to do these extra raids at night. We just need to wait the Germans out.
Yeah.
That's how you're going to get back home to your to your farm, to your family, whatnot. You know. So, all right, June 5th, the German commander called off the attack after the Marines thwarted them there at the road, and they ordered them to dig in. So Hill 142, which is near Belleau Wood, it's part of the wood, and it's just like these thick woods in the middle of these wheat fields. 3 fresh companies of Germans. They had white piping on the uniform, which meant they were Prussians and confident warriors, and very experienced at top of their game. There were no better. Supposedly, there were no better soldiers in the world. One of our monikers or nicknames, Devil Dog, Teufelhunden, was taken from a letter from one of the army, one of the German soldiers. His body was, the letter came out and it was translated, "The Americans are savages. They kill everything that moves." They call them Teufelhunden, Devil Dogs. Marine probably wrote home that was their moniker.
Hey, Devil Dogs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You guys get Devil Dog back in the fleet?
Absolutely.
Do you like it?
I don't mind it, especially when you start knowing the legacy behind it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I've seen Marines get Devil Dogged, and some of the youngsters, and they're just like, man, he just Devil Dogged me. He just DD'd me.
Oh.
I don't think they understood that.
Well, I've got a side story here. You know, when guys are stationed out in California and they want to go to, what's that little party city in Mexico?
Oh, Tijuana?
Tijuana, yeah. So we'll have guys, because back then you didn't always need your birth certificate, you didn't need a passport, and so you weren't allowed to go to Tijuana. But then they would cross the border and start walking, making their way, and then someone on the other side, like a gunny, like, hey, Devil Dogs! So you could always tell who the Marines were, because they turn around, they always got caught because of that,
And yeah. What was the gunny doing down there?
No, he was on the other side, catching people.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Where are you going?
Right, Devil Dog? Gotcha.
Man, Marines never changed.
Right.
Everywhere
so
you
smart,
go,
but
anywhere.
so dumb.
Exactly. Go to the wrong places at the wrong time. So, and now the Germans are digging in, and the Americans know that they're digging in. So outside of Belleau Wood is a village. Borsch is the name of the village. We have to take that village because it's kind of like a gateway or pathway, gives cover so you can attack the woods itself. Because again, the woods are in the middle of these wheat fields, and to get to it, you have to go through the open ground in the wheat fields to get into it to attack. And that's why this battle was so hard for the Marines.
I guess that village helps with recovering and re-ammoing and stuff
Yeah,
like
I mean,
that.
gave cover
and
and concealment, and absolutely. So,
place to take the wounded as well, I'm assuming.
yeah, or it gives them cover to handle the wounded for sure.
Yeah.
So now Colonel Catlin, he is the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines. We talked about him before. He was a Medal of Honor recipient. He got an order from a motorcycle orderly. It said, seize the village and the railroad station. And before it could attack, he was shot and severely wounded. Wasn't died, but he's out of the picture now. So Lieutenant Cates, now one of his company, in one of the companies, he's only a platoon commander. He was ordered to take the town of 300 Germans with just his platoon and some extras. So he was told to do it, and he absolutely did it. Lieutenant Cates took a company against 300 Germans that were embedded in the town, and all of them had machine guns. They would not have been able to take Belleau Wood without taking this town. Belleau Wood was a kidney shape in a square mile of natural heavy forest. In it was the largest, most experienced and well-led unit in the German division. There was a reason why they were at the front of this whole big push. It was the 461st Imperial German Infantry, and it was the force of 1,200 men. So back then, that's like a reinforced battalion. It was commanded by one Major Joseph Bischoff, an old West African soldier who had learned the art of the bush fighting. So again, like Pershing, he had been around the world fighting these smaller wars, but a warrior for sure. he was fighting in the German colonies in Africa. His positions were intricate that he made in the forest here in Belleau Wood, complex and full of machine guns and mortars. The wood was one huge machine gun nest with over 200 guns. His men built the defenses in 3 days. So they dug trenches and parapets and made these very complex defenses all in 3 days. The Marines had to fight for a month on 6 separate attacks to eliminate the Germans at great cost. So this guy Bischoff, he's noteworthy in that he's earned the Iron Cross twice and the Blue Max. And the Blue Max, and he actually got the Blue Max, which is very high, the highest medal that they could give a soldier at the time in World War I for this defense. So at the outbreak of the Great War, he was a battalion commander of number 60 in France. So he started the war in 1914. And in March of 16, he became regiment commander in Turkey, who fought Arabs in Syria and the Sinai Peninsula. Then in 1917, he commanded the 461st and took part in fighting on the Eastern Front. And now, February of 18, we're getting closer to where he's at now. He was ordered where he's at now to the Western Front and served here up until May when we defeated him. So, Blue Max, 2 Iron Crosses, just a badass. That's their leader. He's just a major too. So, by the end of the morning, the second day, more Marines were killed or wounded than the entire history of the Marine Corps. Let me rephrase that. By the morning of the second day, the Battle of Belleau Woods, more Marines were killed or wounded than in the entire history of the Marine Corps. So, 24 hours of fighting, we've lost 31 officers and 1,056 men. Out of those casualties, when we talk about casualties that are killed and wounded, 6 officers and 222 killed in a 24-hour period.
And it'd be the biggest loss in the Marine Corps in just 24 hours.
Yep.
Wow.
That's.
I mean, all of our conflicts combined up until that time, we lost more in that one first skirmish than our entire Marine Corps history.
Goodness.
Yeah. 2-5, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, 3 days prior to the battle, had 30 officers and 1,000 men. Now, they had 4 officer replacements and 300 men left. So by 15 June, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines were relieved with more than 50% casualties. The Army 7th Infantry Division went into Belleau Wood in the evening of the 15th. It originally belonged to the French, but Major General Bundy threatened to take the command of all U.S. forces, so the French acquiesced. Wise's 2-5 left Paris May 31st with over 1,000 men and 30 officers. Now the battalion had 350 men and 6 officers. On 23 June, 3-5, commanded by Major Shearer, was told to clear the woods forthwith. So now 2-5 is out. That first battalion who went on the road. Now a new battalion is in with 3-5, and they're told to attack the woods. Major Shearer, an enlisted man in the Army during the Spanish-American War, he now commanded 3-5. A rebel yell charged under intense machine gun fire. The Marines attacked. On one occasion, a Marine runner was captured, and upon interrogation by a German officer who spoke perfect English, asked the young Marine, what are the Americans going to do next? And this private, cocky as heck, private says, oh, you know what? An entire Marine regiment is coming in and steamrolling today.
Right.
We're attacking today. That wasn't the case. He just made up the story.
What a badass story that is. For
It
a little
is.
private to just
Right.
He's just
That's what we're
completely
doing.
fool all those higher leadership and the Germans.
So this is what happened. The German officer decided to surrender to the private right then.
No kidding.
Could you imagine that?
Wow.
The young Marine ordered them to lay down their weapons calmly and lead him back to the lines.
Oh,
When he got back to the lines, he had 4 German officers and 78 men that surrendered to this kid.
That takes some big
Wow.
kahunas.
That is
That's
incredible.
impressive
Yes.
as hell.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. Shearer announced the entire woods now U.S. Marines, completely owned by the U.S. Marines, which wasn't really necessarily the case. Okay. So they had a successful advance, and they took all these prisoners, but they actually weren't even near getting ready to finish this battle.
Do you think he received a field promotion?
Right.
Probably got a meritorious mass.
Right.
You know?
Lieutenant.
So Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall, the great Army historian, wrote, Belleau Wood was just one of those things, like Lexington and the Alamo, an accident that changed the face of history. From the first blow, both sides remained absolutely committed to the German Crown Prince, who commanded the Army Group. He was a little foolish to let it happen that way. He was hazarding the highest possible stakes in a local dogfight, and he had picked the wrong people. The Marine Brigade became, because it was unique, a little raft of sea soldiers in an ocean of the Army, was without doubt the most aggressive body of diehards on the Western Front. Badass coming from an Army general.
Oh.
That had to be read. And a lot of, again, one of my other sources that I have to, give props to is from Dick Camp. He's a Marine Corps historian, the Devil Dogs at Belleau Wood.
Well, we got to talk about. I know you didn't mention Sergeant Major Dan Daly anymore,
Yeah,
but at the time he was a first sergeant, so he was part of. He was with Major Barry's battalion 3-5, but he was really attached to 3-6. And the date is June 16th. Oh, I'm sorry, June 6th, 1916. I'm so sorry. June 6th, 1918. One of the charges is where he had his famous lines.
Yeah.
Hey, sons of bitches, do you want to live forever? So, I think it's important to talk about that.
Yeah,
and,
let's do it.
He's an enlisted man. Well, that's all I got. Let's do it. That's all I got.
Yeah.
But it just kind of goes in with the spirit of how it was, and you always have to lean on your leadership. And here we had multiple leadership here, or leaders, who were just like gung ho and let's get this shit done and let's get out of here and let's prove ourselves.
Absolutely.
And Sergeant Major Dan Daly was right there with them.
Yeah,
as well.
we talked about him before we got on, but
Mm-hmm.
2 Medals of Honor.
Yep.
One in the Boxer Rebellion, the other in Haiti. And again, for this action here that you just talked about, they wanted to put him up for another one, but they said, nah, 3's too much. But he got a Distinguished Service Cross out of it, which is the second highest.
Goodness,
That was from the Army. He didn't even get a Navy Cross.
Yeah.
What's up with that?
Right. I
Some-
don't know.
Some colonel or major probably said, give him a meritorious mass.
He's being too greedy, even though he just did all his badass stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, so Dan Daly, that's this part of the battle we're talking about. But let's get back to that cocky private who got captured and basically had the Germans surrender to him just because he said that a whole regiment of Marines were going to come today and attack today. Where did he get that? Maybe he already was pretty cocky, but with leaders like Dan Daly, leaders that had served in Veracruz, and leaders that the people they had been with for a whole year, that badassery and that confidence just permeates down to the lowest rank, right?
Right.
Your attitude reflects your leadership.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then to be so, well trained, because we're back in 1917. I mean, there wasn't a lot of resources as much. But when you're sitting there being trained to that level and being respected and being, that low on the totem pole, that brings a lot of pride to it as well. Like, hey, I'm only 20 and they're treating me like, I'm a war hero already.
Yeah.
So I think that brings a lot of the pride as well, and the tact and the ability to, you got to do what you got to do. And that's exactly what he did. And it's pretty badass.
Confidence begets confidence, and heroism begets heroism.
Right.
You don't want to let the people down when you're left and right, for sure.
And I know it's a Iwo Jima quote, but common valor was uncommon, or what is that from Iwo Jima? Uncommon virtue was.
Uncommon valor was a common virtue.
Right, so it kind of leads
Admiral
me
Chester
into.
Nimitz.
There you go. So it kind of leads me into this as well. There's
Absolutely.
huge valor here.
Yeah. Again, we're a pubescent nation, a very young nation, but our Marine Corps was so small before this, and now this is the largest the Marine Corps has ever been, and this is our largest land battle as a continental type army in second generation warfare, and we're starting off the bat a little bit of, little trench warfare for 56 days. So understand what it's like in the trenches with the rats and the lice and the raids and all that kind of stuff and disease. And now we have a little bit of R&R after that, a little high-fiving, and then Belleau Wood kicks off.
Right.
First battalion that went in online thwarted their attack, but they lost. They took heavy losses.
Yeah.
You know, it was extremely heavy losses. Now the 2nd Battalion is in there. We talked about taking the town and then making the waves into the forest itself. 2 Marines under Holcomb, who becomes a commandant too. There's a common theme with the leadership too. Most of them, if they survived, they became leaders in our Corps and brought our Corps the training and experience needed to win in World War II as well. Enter day 1 of 2-6, now under Holcomb. His battalion is up. Duncan was the first to fall. Captain Dowland Francis Duncan of St. Joe, Missouri, walked carelessly into hell, swinging a cane and smoking a pipe. He was killed with a round to the abdomen in his best uniform. Holcomb wrote, "Poor old Duncan, my favorite company commander, was killed." This company was a bunch of wild Indians, according to Sergeant Sheridan, a friend of Duncan, from Missouri as well. A man named Lieutenant Robertson took over. So going back to our previous conversation, here's another brand new spanking lieutenant who already had a reputation of just being confident. He had a pipe in his mouth, he had a swagger stick, he was wearing his best uniform into the battle.
Swinging a cane.
Out front. His Marines loved him. His seniors loved him. And he got killed, unfortunately, and his best friend lamented, and so did everyone else. But again, that's the kind of attitude that these leaders had brought to this unit. So you hear it over and over again. And that kind of attitude you bring to a company, you know, it's the same thing. You bring courageous people that will take chances smartly and stand up in front, and people are going to follow you.
Absolutely,
for sure.
absolutely. Man, I know I'm kind of going on a side note, but I wanted to mention. I thought somewhere, you know, when we were talking about this legacy to prove, I thought you said somewhere that also kind of the Marine Corps was brand new. Their nickname was even like bellhops because they were so uninvolved.
Seagoing bellhops.
Yeah, so they
Because they were on ships.
Okay.
They were.
But their uniforms were so nice and clean and crisp.
Right.
And their nickname was bellhops because they hadn't proved themselves
That was
yet.
one of the monikers. But
Okay.
we had been proving ourselves in the small skirmishes,
Right.
like the Boxer Rebellion and the Spanish-American War, but our numbers were so small. And even like in our Mexican campaign,
Right.
in War with Mexico, our numbers were so small.
Right.
But now here we're kind of growing as a... And again, our leadership, they understand this. And I see even today with the Navy and the Marine Corps, all the 3 MUs that I've been on, I see it. You got to, as Marines, we had to fight for everything. It's like that today, you know. We had to fight for
Respect.
it.
And, you know,
Not respect.
It was just like chow time,
To get-
better bunks and like better showers that don't clog up, you know.
just space.
So
you know.
it was a constant. It was a constant battle to get people in front. So again, if you're that guy, if you're the commandant or you're the head of your company, you've got to find a way to get your people out in the front. If that means
Right.
being buddies with the president or your competitors or knowing what your competitors are going to do, then you've got to do those things.
Or socking someone at some point because
Yeah.
the Marines love to do that too.
Absolutely. I'm sure there was a lot of those backroom brawls that went on as well. But yeah, you're right. So some of that was inter-service rivalry, but yeah, being on a ship as a Marine detachment and you're at the beck and call of the ship's captain and all that kind of stuff.
So outnumbered.
Yep. And then when you go to shore, you're the sea soldiers on the shore, but you're still under the command of the Navy.
Mhm.
The seagoing bellhops, yeah, that's kind of a derogatory term.
Right,
But,
right.
okay, the situation remained perilous, ridiculously. Really, the 96th Company could not go forward, and it could not retreat. But as another Marine would write, there was always one good solution to any pickle one found oneself in on the battlefield. Charge.
Charge!
There you go. These accounts say that Lieutenant Cates yelled at the new lieutenant who took over for the company, the new company commander, "Come on, Robertson, let's go. Get up." So as Cates got up, the company got up as one and went forward to the objective. No teamwork, no cover and maneuver, just all one body. That's how they fought back in those days. They didn't, cover and maneuver yet. This is still just second generation warfare.
Just balls to the wall, charge. Yeah.
They leaned forward and low as a single entity. A maelstrom of machine gun fire erupted. Lieutenant Cates continued to lead his 4th platoon down to the town. Cates was shot in the head and knocked out. Robertson took over. So I'm going to read a little bit about the Cates attack. And again, it's a future commandant, and follow him throughout this whole war. Cates came to after about 5 or 10 minutes. Just how long, he couldn't tell. All he knew was that the war had not ended. German machine guns were still pumping lead at the company's thinning ranks, and bullets spraying the ground around him. His first thought was to run to the rear. He hates to admit it. I hate to admit it, but yeah, it was it. With his sheep. Bleh. I'm getting tired too. I'll cut that out.
Do some jumping jacks.
His first thought was to run to the rear. I hate to admit it, but that was it. He would sheepishly admit years later. He tried to put on his helmet, but the dent made by the bullet was so large, the doggone thing wouldn't go on. He would later laugh, looking east, and saw that 4 of the company's men from the 1st platoon, among them Sheridan, had taken cover in a ravine on the far right of the village. So I went there staggering over. Cates would recall. I fell 2 or 3 times, they told me. So he's still groggy from getting shot in the head, and he's still going. Sergeant Tom Orgo sees Cates and, still reeling from the blow to his head, took out his canteen and began pouring cheap red wine over Cates' head. So we got Marines with wine in their canteens. Hey, they're in France, right? Cates told him, "Don't pour it on me, let me drink it." Cates grabbed the canteen and took a big gulp. Suddenly revived, he began to consider a situation. There was only one thing to do. Charge.
Charge.
Before. He picked up a discarded French rifle, told the others to follow. Again, out front, brand new lieutenant. And then the 5 Marines began crawling toward the town. The ravine covering their movement. About that time, he saw a bunch of Germans at the edge of town, Cates would recall. We let go at them and they ran. So their reputation and their performance these first 4 days of the battle, the Germans are already like, oh, I can mess with these guys. Just then, Cates saw that Robertson was leaving the west end of the town with about 20 Marines. Cates blew his whistle and yelled at Robertson, who double-timed towards his subordinate with a small group. Remember, Robertson is the new company commander. After the very popular one got killed, Robertson.
And just after 10 minutes?
Yeah.
It seems like, well.
Yeah, this stuff happens quick.
Change of command that quickly, yeah.
Yeah, change of command happens that quick. Robertson handed over the reins and told him, "All right, you take your platoon and clean out the town, and I'll go get reinforcements." So here's the new company commander with these Marines following him. He's coming out of the village. Cates is going into the village with his guys. He says, "You take these guys with your platoon. I'm going to go away and get some reinforcements." There aren't really going to get reinforcements. This is like I'm a lingerer. No, but again, some people, you don't know what's going to happen when you get in that first combat, right? So I'll get reinforcements. So, which I thought was a hell of a thing to do. Cates would shake his head and say years later, still wondering why the company's senior officer would essentially hand over the unit to a subordinate in the face of the enemy. So, again, that's noteworthy because, yeah, we've got a lot of heroics going on, and that's why we won most all of our battles in history, including this one. But there's always going to be that guy that's not going to pull his weight, and especially in a leadership position, they're not going to last.
Right.
And further reading in the book, he actually gets put in for this battle. That Robertson guy, he gets put in for a Distinguished Service Cross for being the company commander at the time, while all of his subordinates are getting.
Well,
so everyone knows when someone gets an award. That's the other thing.
Yeah.
This is a good conversation to have. If you get an award or a bonus for making the best sales or whatever, or doing, it has to be earned.
Right.
Because other people are going to see that they know he didn't do those sales, or he didn't recruit,
Right.
the 200
They know the
people.
real story.
Right.
You know who did exactly the real
We
story.
didn't even appreciate the people who helped him get there.
Yeah,
Which is
absolutely.
another bad thing about bad leaders.
Yeah, absolutely.
I feel like Kate's model would be balls. You either got them or you grow them.
That's
yeah,
right.
There we go. I got to fit it in somewhere. Yeah.
I wasn't gonna say that, but I'm glad that you did.
Yeah.
So, because some of us have them, and some of us don't. Just kidding, Brittany.
Mine are inside.
Okay, so Kate's again. So we're gonna follow him through this war for the rest of the war. Kate's wounded again by a sniper in the shoulder. So in a matter of hours, he's been hit in the head by a round, and then now he's hit in the shoulder. And eventually took the town. He took the town. Out of the 56 men who started, they lost 32, 8 dead and 42 wounded. So so now he took the town. Led. Does that make sense?
Right, but how do you take a whole town with only 56 men?
You spread them out and you go door to door.
Right.
Ballsy. And this is not a big town, but
Right.
it's a town.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you got 56 guys with you.
And some of the best German soldiers as well.
Yeah,
Right?
but they've
So,
got the news. I mean, they're like, oh, these guys are the front end. There's going to be more following. So again, their reputation precedes them.
And they're trying to get the hell out of there. The
Right.
Germans are, yeah.
So that night, Cates takes the town. That night, the Marine Corps sends more reinforcements in. So Second Lieutenant Cates has like 600 Marines in the town, right?
Oh, good.
And he's like the governor of the town for one night. And I'm going to tell a story about a Houstonian who was with Cates, who was actually Cates' orderly. So there's a Houstonian and there's a street. You guys know the street called Dunleavy in Houston?
Absolutely,
You know
yeah.
Dunleavy? Okay.
Right there by like River Oaks.
Yes. That's an area. So
Yeah.
Dunleavy and Wall Street are named
Wall, yeah.
after two Marines that were killed in this unit. Dunleavy was killed on June 8th, 1918. He was Cates' orderly with 2-6, the night of June 7th to 8th with Cates. They had a shell land near them and a concussion killed him. On June 6th, he had earned a Navy Cross. So a couple days before, he had already earned the Navy Cross for attack on the village. And that's where we're at now. He earned a Distinguished Service Cross when he got killed. His fellow Houstonian, Private Thomas Wall of the 73rd Machine Gun Company, 6 Marines, was later killed on September 15th at the Battle of St. Michel, which we'll go over. So, being a Houstonian, I need to bring that up. It came up in the 6 Marines history books, but I knew that these 2 Marines were from Houston, so props to them.
Rough.
H-Town.
Hoorah, H-Town. So now, after Cates takes the town that night, he wakes up and he's relieved. I'm sure very relieved. He's been shot twice. Single-handedly, basically, just takes his town. So now they earned a well-earned rest in the rear. So they take his army, or his company, and his battalion, and on 10th June, let's see here, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, he goes into rest and relaxation. So now the fighting continues in the battle, though. 10 June, 1-6, 1st Battalion, 6 Marines, goes up. That was the battalion I was with for a year at Camp Lejeune. A lot of history there. He got south of the Germans and fought a strong point along Hill 181. On the next day, 11 June, 2-5, Colonel Fritz Wise. Again, they were the original battalion on the road. Now they're reinforced and they're coming back into the fight. And they marched finally 250 yards, and they were the first one to enter the woods. So now they're fighting through the wheat, getting mowed down by machine guns, and 2-5s with Colonel Fritz gets in there. Still, the Germans commanded half of the woods, so they've got half of the woods with the Marines, and then the other half they still have to get. 2-5 got 150 replacements, and they continued to bayonet through and kill the Hun. And you know the famous paintings of them bayoneting in the 6 Marine bases in Marine Corps history. That's where this is all coming from. So a couple days before getting to town, going through the wheat, now they're in the actual forest, going, trench to trench, dugout to dugout, bayoneting and doing hand-to-hand fighting.
So is like the Hun, is that just the kind of a nickname for the historic like Mongolian troops?
No, the
what
Hun
they're doing? Yeah.
is the nickname for the Germans.
Okay.
The Hun and the Bush, they're also called the Bush.
Okay.
They're both derogatory names for the German. It's like calling the Japanese the Japs or the Viet Cong.
Vietnamese, back
I
home.
don't want to
Okay.
say them on the speaker, even if it's going to be edited out. Yeah.
Right.
But where did you have any idea where that comes from? The Hun? Like, why would that be?
I don't know we can look it up.
Origin.
Yeah, but they call them the Huns. Like with the aviators.
That's the Mongolian force against China, too, right?
Well, the Huns?
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah.
But I know that as an aviator, the Hun in the sun, look out for the Hun in the sun is what they used to say. So always be looking out your back towards the sun because they would get behind, they would put the sun behind them and that's how they would attack because you couldn't see them.
Oh, that makes sense.
So that's a little aviation. We still use that today. I'll cut all that out. All right, so June 12th, they continue Indian-style attacks in ravines and rocky terrain, hand-to-hand, fierce combat. And again, that's where you see the famous paintings of. And they actually had an artist and journalist follow them, so he took first-hand accounts of this. He was with the Marines the whole time. In 2 days of fighting, 2-5 had 300 of the original 1,000 men. So again, they went through another bloodying and went through the whole thing again. Cates was still recuperating, but Holcomb visited Cates because now one of the battalions that was in the town, the Germans are starting to filter back into the town, and they did a counterattack to take the town back. Mm-hmm. So Holcomb, or actually, their commander, Colonel Holcomb, who becomes the commandant, goes down to Cates while they're resting and relaxing. He's like, Cates, can you take the town again? Cates looks up to him and says, gulps. He's like, yes, sir, I can take the town. So.
And it says recuperating. Was he in a field hospital somewhere, or were they just on R&R?
No, they were recuperating in a field, just a couple, not even a mile away.
Right. Okay.
They're out of the fight, the hand-to-hand and the gunfight, right. But they're close enough to where they're not getting shot at. That's R&R, kind of, you know what I mean?
It's good enough for R&R.
So they thought so much of Cates. They're like, hey, you lead another attack into the town, and here it is, the second lieutenant, man, because he already done it before.
Right.
So he's like, gulps, and it's like, yes, sir. Fucking balls on that guy, man.
Right.
So Cates' company gets there, and as soon as they get into position to attack the town, the Germans at this part of the battle, they shot more than 6,000 mustard gas shells with shrapnel. And by June 16th, the evacuation hospital, the closest hospital they're evacuating, received 700 Marines suffering from mustard gas. Cates' company had 14 gassed in action. Cates had a platoon of 15 men and assigned to another platoon. So after the second attack, he didn't even get to go into the town. They got gassed and were pushed back immediately. And in the book, I Will Hold, Cates actually forgot his gas mask.
Oh.
He left his gas mask in the rear, but he knew one of his Marines had stolen a German gas mask. I think his name was Private Hill or something, and he's crawling, holding his breath, with his mouth over his breath in the middle of the battle. Hey, Hill, do you have that German gas mask? He crawled over, grabbed it, and put the gas mask on so they were getting gas.
Wow.
So they used mustard gas early in the war, the Germans did.
I was going to ask.
I was too, yeah.
They did, but now they're using it here. I mean, this is like all out, full, their best battalion in the front, all of their most advanced weapons, and now they're finally the Marines weren't just gas, they used it all along the lines, right? So 6,000 gas shells, and over 700 Marines got suffered with the gas. They either died from it or they put out in action.
Right, absolutely.
So it burns.
Right.
Anything you got exposed, it burns your skin, but it gets into your lungs and it bubbles. It puts blisters inside of your lungs to make it extremely hard to breathe, or you can't breathe if you've got a very, and then all of your body, if you're sweating, it gets through your clothes. You're just a miserable mess. It's the worst kind of thing. The suffering.
Gas was the thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm assuming this is something they trained on as well, or they knew you'd get gas attacks.
They had to get their gas mask on in 5 seconds. That was the standard. And you see as they go through. I mean, even that photo back there, all the pictures you see the square gas mask on the front. It had to be that close to their faces because they had to get it out quickly.
Yeah.
The standard was 5 seconds. It was a pain in the neck, but of course they needed it. I mean, they got gas. So he didn't get to do the attack, and he went back. And again, now he's wounded 3 times. Shot in the head, shot in the shoulder. Now he's been gassed.
God.
So June 30th, Case's company, the 96 company, had 30 dead, and everyone else gassed and wounded. 100% casualties. Back into the woods they went. They went back into the breach. First week of August, the 4th Brigade was assigned to another sector. Cates relieved the French the night of the 8th and 9th of August. And it was, okay, so I'm going to backtrack a bit. So he goes back to the woods, goes through another firefight, or another iteration, a day or two of combat, and then he comes back, and now he's giving like it's not a frontline assignment, but it's an assignment away from the serious fighting. So they're supposed to go up and relieve some French troops where it's relatively quiet. Yeah, there's some shooting going on, but I mean, him and his men have pretty much had these first couple of weeks, right? As all of 2-5 and all of 2-6, the 5th and 6th Marines, as they're taking the wood. And that's why it's such an important and such a famous battle in our history. All right. 1 a.m., 12 September 1918. Back to the show again. 48 American batteries erupt. One continuous roar. From 5 a.m., 15 light batteries began with a rolling barrage of 10 meters every 4 minutes, or 100 meters every 4 minutes, and then the whistle blew. So the Battle of Belleau Wood, costly battle for the Marine Corps. Eventually we took the battle. The next assignment that we got was the battle for St. Mihiel. And this is not just a Marine battle, but a large divisional battle with the Army and the Marines all interacting together on this town, not far from Belleau Wood. So Cates, actually, as the company commander of the 96, had 30 dead and everyone else gassed and wounded. We talked about that. He had 100% casualties. And his company, oh yeah, so this is it. After the Battle of Belleau Wood, Cates goes on leave, and they give his company to another captain, a brand new captain, a young 27-year-old strapping Naval Academy graduate. When he comes back after the R&R, after being wounded 3 times, right? He comes back in a couple days. He's got another company commander. They gave it to him. I think Holcomb saw that he needed a rest, and they were going into another big battle of St. Mihiel. And basically, Cates was, in the book, he was saddened and relieved at the same time. Even though he was going to be a part of it, he wasn't going to be up front with the rest of the troops. Right. So they gave him 50 Marines, and he had a provisional company behind them to stay basically back in the rear. So as American forces went forward, he was behind maybe a quarter mile building road. Him and his Marines were building up roads. This kind of gave him a break. Yeah. Long story short, after the battle, that company commander was severely wounded, not killed, but severely wounded, and he did end up getting the company command after that battle. But he needed that break, and I think that Holcomb saw that, his battalion commander saw that, and that's why he wasn't given the company right away. So now we're getting ready for the big battle, the big push through St. Mihiel. And again, it's a large Army, Marine Corps rolling barrage attack on this city, on this town. So the show began on 1 a.m. on September the 12th, 1918. 48 American batteries erupted, one continuous roar. At 5 a.m., 15 light batteries began a rolling barrage, 100 meters every 4 minutes. So think about us running the 100 meters in CrossFit.
Right.
So doing that in 4 minutes, that's how slow the barrage was. So all these artillery rounds are going off in front, and the infantry's behind them because the artillery barrage is protecting them. This is on the cusp of the largest American offensive of the war. So nowhere in our history in second generation warfare have America put this many forces out on the field of battle. Cates was disappointed but elated he wasn't the company commander, but he still was a part of it. The Americans stepped off the line. It was a 10-mile front, in other words, 10 miles in front, following tanks. So there, at this time of the war, we have some tanks, but there was little resistance. It was more of a pursuit than a fight. By September 15th, the 5th and 6th Marines had more than 16,000 prisoners and 443 guns. So enter Cliff Cates. He now has his company back after that battle, and the other company commander was wounded, and he's given the mission to actually hold this hill on the west side of Saint Mihiel, and Mihiel is spelled Michel. During the battle, 5th Marines lost 421 officers and men killed and wounded. In contrast, 2nd Division only lost 9 officers and 186 men killed, 34 officers and 1,000 wounded. So 1/3 of the losses of Soissons. So again, this is toward the end of the war. They're having less losses now. We had a lot of losses there at Belleau Wood, and now this big push. The Germans, again, it's not like they're attacking back. Now they're kind of retreating, and it's more of a pursuit. But at this town, Cates is given, and his company is given the responsibility of holding this whole western flank off, because the French were supposed to come up, but they didn't come with us. They stopped at a certain point, so this whole western side was completely exposed. And the Germans counterattacked. They counterattacked with some very big weapons and a battalion-sized force against Cates' company, the 96th. They were able to thwart the attack and keep them off. Yes, they had the high ground, and yes, the 50-something men, whatever, but this is an entire German company. I mean, some German battalion that's attacking. So Cates, in the middle of the fight, he finds 4 French tanks, and he's like, hey, you 4 French tanks, you go help us down there in the bottom. So it kept that battalion at bay from getting behind the lines and causing havoc. And that was on Cates as
So
well.
is stuff like that more of a miscommunication with the French, or is it just kind of like they just backed off?
They backed off.
Yeah.
They know the war is coming to an end. This is weeks before the armistice, and already the Lance Corporal Network, they're already talking about it, right? You know,
We're going home.
yeah. I mean, they know the 11th hour, 11th day, 11th month.
But why? So I asked in the beginning of the podcast, but how do you form an armistice? How do you have a date for the ending of a war?
Because the politicians, folk, and the French government and the German German government, they've been talking.
Right. They just gotta take whatever you could up until this date, and then.
So it's in the newspaper because
No.
I doubt the leadership would tell their their Marines that.
No,
Hey,
but people are getting news. They're
Right.
getting letters that people back. I mean, even back then, the social media and the Lance Corporal Network, it's going on, man. They know.
yeah.
But I just don't understand, if they have a date in mind, why would they just say, let's do it today? Why would they have a date in the future?
Because if it
You know,
doesn't,
does that make sense? Like,
yeah, no, but think about it. So they're going to have this potential date. What if the date doesn't happen and everyone's just sitting in their trenches? I can look at it both ways,
yeah.
you know. But anyways, you got to be prepared, and you know the senior leadership has their fangs out. And again, through history, some say that they made a big mistake by having that big push the night before to cross the Meuse. The Meuse River, which is next to the Aragon Forest, the Meuse Argonne, that was the final place. And this river, which was 300 feet wide, very deep, and it's wintertime. This is November. This is the fall now. So the rains have got this river swelling, and it's extremely rapid. It's not like rapids, but you can't swim across it.
Right.
And they had these rickety bridges they had to get across, right? And basically, they were told to cross the river, get on the north side of the river, and pursue the Germans the night before the armistice. Some units did, some units didn't. So the question was, some historians are saying that they made the wrong decisions. They should have waited the night prior, because they lost like the Marines. We lost 400 and something Marines the night prior trying
Within
to cross
12
the river.
hours of
Yeah.
armistice. Wow.
Yeah, talking about a morale boost.
Right.
Morale suck. All right, October 3, 1918. The next step, General Lejeune, or another future commandant, took command from General Harbert after Soissons. And now we're in the next phase of the attack, or next phase of the war, getting towards the end, almost the end of the war. Lejeune's 2nd Division was attached to the French's 4th Division as they were to take Mont Blanc. This was precarious because the Boche were expecting an open flank. The push had Cates leading the way all the way up. So his company led the way all the way up to to Mont Blanc with 2-6, and on his right, one of his friends, another company commander, leading the 78th. So the battalion 2-6 was in the front, then 1-6, then 3-6 in the back, and the entire rest of the brigade was behind them. So the march from the beginning when they started at to go to Mont Blanc, in 2 hours, the Marines accomplished what the French had tried to accomplish in 4 years and cost them 175,000 lives. The attack, the Marines started to fall like tin pins. In other words, the machine gun fire was knocking them down. This was an unforgiving second-generation war. They drove through the Germans like a wedge. They captured 250 Germans and 18 artillery pieces. Even though we're losing Marines, we're getting more Marines coming in behind them, fresh Marines that are coming in for the guys like Cates that have been wounded multiple times and are leading the attack. The French, on the other hand, and the Brits too, man, they just had it. We've just talked about it. And putting yourself in their place, I mean, I think it's cowardice. I just think it was a fact and reality of war. Even the Americans didn't want to lose their lives, at this, they know they have weeks left, right?
Yeah.
So, and they know the Germans are on the run too.
And I think it's huge too that the Americans weren't even defending their own land, really, and they still came in and were helping as much as they did.
Yeah, but like you said,
incredible.
Our young country, a lot of them are from immigrant families.
That's true. Yeah.
And that American spirit, and that
they
American,
might know cousins and nephews and stuff.
Yeah,
in the other side.
And that that call to action, that call to war, the hero's journey. A youngster in college, you're banging away at Yale, and this war's going on. I mean, I remember when the Gulf War was going on. I was a reservist in the Marine Corps, and I was going to college. I was in an officer program. I'm like, I wanted to be there. I didn't want to be watching CNN.
Right.
The same with the Americans back then. They wanted to be into the fight. It was like that with the Spanish Civil War.
Right.
We had Americans go over there. It was like that with the breakout of World War II. We had Americans that joined Canadian forces because they went to fight first before we got into the war. It's just in our DNA.
Wow, I didn't know
You know
that.
that? Yeah, both on the aviation side.
And not a negative thing, but that world police where, morality is going to come first, honor, courage, commitment. And if people are trying to mess that up in the world, America wants to be there to fix it and to fight that evil.
We earned the world's 911. That's a pretty cool moniker to have.
Right. I've always thought it was good too.
Before the war on terror, we were considered the 911 force.
Right.
And so.
And that sounds a lot better than world police. I like 911 a lot better, for sure.
Yeah, most definitely. Okay, so we talked about this before, putting things in perspective. That's why that left flank wasn't, that was left exposed, and Lieutenant Cates was able to defend it. So once that was over, there was a 17-hour, okay, so here comes the morale part. And I'm not going to read this because I've got pretty much. So they had to march now for 17 hours to get to the next battle, which was the Argonne Forest, the Meuse-Argonne. So all the forces, Pershing, the Brits, France, everyone's getting their pieces together to push the Germans north over the Meuse and continue to pursue them until the armistice is actually sounded. And if the armistice doesn't get signed, that's the other thing. What if it doesn't get signed?
True.
You've got to get as much ground as you possibly can. And I'm thinking, not like Lance Corporal Bagnado now. Yeah. So that's what you got to put things in perspective. And you are wearing a uniform and you are at war. So you got to do what you're. Does it suck? Yes. I wouldn't want to die the day before, the week before that you leave. And I'll talk about casualties in Iraq, some of the most contested areas in Fallujah and Ramadi, the battalions that rotated in and out of those towns in 2004, 5, and 6. Their casualty rates were between 19 and say 25 killed and over 200 wounded in action. Battalions in a 7-month period. The majority of those casualties came in the beginning of their deployment because again, they're training, they're doing left seat, right seat, and right before they left. Weeks before they left. That's the preponderance of their casualties came beginning weeks and then ending weeks. So the same kind of thing here. Sucks.
Just like a natural complacency, just natural. You're just getting tired, and then it's the end.
Complacency kills.
Kind of thing.
Your last week, your last patrol, and
I'm going home.
Countless stories, man. Countless stories. It's sad. But same thing on a larger scale. So now they've got a march, 17-hour marches here, and now there's an epidemic in Europe right now, influenza, and a lot of the soldiers are getting influenza. So they're marching in wet, cold, rainy. They can't. I mean, everything they own is completely wet, and they're marching to the next battle.
With blood and mud all over it. Could
Oh,
you
yeah.
imagine having your buddy's blood on you the whole rest of the war
Yeah.
or something? You know?
Yeah,
It's
there's
just-
no quickie cleaners
Yeah,
and there's
yeah.
no showers. I mean, the rain is your shower. And it's torrential downpours. And Cates was so sick at this time, he writes in the book and he talks about it. He didn't think he was going to make it to the Argonne Forest. He thought he was going to either perish or get knocked out before he got to the forest. And he wasn't alone. The preponderance of the deaths at this time in the war came from influenza. And there was an epidemic in Europe at the time. And it was spread amongst the soldiers, and Marines.
We all know it spreads quickly in the military.
Yep.
It's the close quarters, so many different people. Yeah.
Okay, so now, long story short, after slugging it out aggressively and keeping the Boche at bay, battle after battle, they had to endure their battalion, actually the whole brigade, almost 70 miles of movement, 70 miles of marching to the next battle. Yes, it's the infantry, but where are the trucks this time? When you're considered the shock troops of the division, you should have a plan. But Lejeune sent them to serve with the French division. Orders are orders, and Lejeune could not let the relationship tarnish the reputation of the Marines. So instead of fighting on their own as a Marine brigade, they attached them to a French division at this time. So now, October 22nd, 1918, Argonne Forest, the last battle. The end is near. Everyone can smell it. The march taxed the endurance and will of every Marine, and Cates did not expect to survive the hike. He was sick, and they lacked dry clothes, food, and had been at the front of the most intense combat at this scale in Marine Corps history. Then they saw the trucks. Finally, the trucks came. After 63 miles of marching, but this was a bad omen. They knew when they saw trucks that they were like the frontline troops, just like when they went to Belleau Wood. They're like, okay, because there's only so many trucks in theater, they're going to send the shock troops in the trucks and get them to the forest as quick as possible. They're just like, damn it.
Damn trucks.
0330 on 1 November 1918, 10 days before the armistice, third phase of the offensive of the Argonne Forest began at 5:30. The company stepped off and went over the top, Cates leading the way. It was not as hard fighting as they had been used to, but it was still fighting. And it was more of pursuit. In other words, when they came into contact, they were basically chasing the Germans to the north, towards the river. 13 hours until peace. They were ordered to cross the Meuse River, cold rushing deep water, 300 feet across, sickness, fatigue, and knowing they had hours to survive and go home to their families. On 10 November 1918, Marine Corps birthday. But they weren't celebrating that yet.
Yes, yeah.
Because Lejeune hadn't become the commandant yet. And
Oh,
Lejeune
right.
started it after World War I. He started the tradition after World War I. Cates only had 50 of the 200 he started with 10 days earlier. Full two-thirds of the regiment had been casualties, mostly to flu and sickness. Or was it mass lingering? I don't think it was mass lingering. There was an epidemic. But if you're on the cusp of the end of the war and you're like teetering, I mean, Lance Bagnato, I'd be like, hey, Gunny, I'm sick. And the Gunny's going to be like, yeah, you three, come with me. You guys get in the truck. Its leadership taking care of their own and Pershing not knowing when to prepare to attack if the armistice does not happen. So again, it's a balancing act. And this is towards the end of the war. Again, this is the last battle, not nearly as hard fought as Belleau Wood and Saint Mihiel. And as they went north, the fighting got easier, but they were more fatigued and they lost. The casualties were enormous.
Right.
We will see casualties like this in World War II, but to put things in perspective, when the Marine Corps shipped over, we shipped over 29,000 Marines. Out of the 29,000, 11,900, almost 12,000 were casualties. So that's 40% casualty rate.
Wow.
That's just not the frontline troops; those are the rear troops and all that, right? So, the Marine Corps is bigger than it has ever been. American losses in World War I, out of the 4.7 million served, American losses were 116,000 killed in action, 63,000 from disease, 53,000 from combat. So we lost more from disease, whether it be trench foot or influenza, than it was from actual combat. 320 sick and wounded. Those are basically the numbers from the Great War. So, from the town of Bourges, Belleau, Cesson, Saint-Mihiel, Mont Blanc, and Argonne, in a 6-month period, Marine Corps history, skyrocketed. Our reputation became, news back in the States. The Germans were 24 hours from Paris. They would walk through Paris. That battalion that first came in was their best battalion. The entire German army would have came right behind them, like a wedge into Paris, and it would have been over. Right. The Germans bet everything on that attack, and they lost.
Did.
From marksmanship.
Barca. I was gonna do it.
Right on.
Yeah.
So lessons from this is morale, making the right decisions at the top, and leadership. You've got to be aggressive. You've got to be courageous. Courage is contagious, but again, cowardice is contagious too. Look where the French were at this time. I don't know if I would call it cowardice, but they are wearing the uniform. But I mean, it just doesn't compute to me not to move forward. It doesn't compute, as a Marine to not want to go out and raid and take prisoners at the trench. So from Houston, thanks for joining us.
That's right.
And we will certainly have more stories, more lessons, more cool stuff to talk about in the future.
And cool co-hosts.
And cool
That's right.
co-hosts. Exactly.
Make sure you like and subscribe.
Right.
Like, subscribe. We'll put a link here. Subscribe to Doomed to Repeat It TV on YouTube, the YouTube channel, or our Facebook page. So for those of you that are leaving good comments and on emails, we appreciate the support as we grow. We've been doing this less than 6 days. So let's keep the views coming. Let us know what we can improve. We'll see you next week for episode 003. And keep out with our social media. We'll let you know what subject it's going to be. But expect 3 to 4 more World War I episodes. Cool?
Bruh.
Cool.
All right. So, from Houston, Texas, one of the lessons, or you're doomed to repeat it.
Kill.
See ya!